Welcome to week 3 of my Pride Run for the Review series, where I'll finally be jumping from the L in LGBT to the next letter over. Today I'll be reviewing Naza Malik, a 2015 drama about the two titular characters working through their relationship as best friends and lovers before suddenly being followed by an FBI agent who suspects that they might be terrorists. Much like Pariah, this movie focuses on the black gay identity, but also goes a step further and tells the story of two black gay Muslim teens living in New York. But despite having such an interesting premise, Naza Malik is lacking in what makes a lot of movies worth watching. This is probably going to be my shortest reviews for this series because 1, this movie is only about 80 minutes long, and 2, there's nothing that's really worth talking about in this movie. As I said before, the movie focuses on the romantic, sexual, and platonic relationship between Naza Malik, two black Muslim teenagers living in New York. But their day of selling lottery cards and scented oils on the street takes a quick turn for the worse when they're suspected to be terrorists after being approached by an undercover FBI agent about buying a gun. This movie had so much potential to be great, but it just falls so flat, so fast, and so hard. You would think that with such an interesting setup, the movie could at least pass itself off on a base level from its representation of a group of people that are often seen as cryptids instead of very real and very alive humans with everyday lives and struggles. But it doesn't even come close to being just an okay movie to even reach the point of being good representation for anyone, let alone black gay Muslims. There's not much to Naza Malik that makes it memorable. The most exciting thing that happens in this movie is when a chicken jumps off of a roof and causes a car crash when it lands on the street. I'm not making that up. I'm being 100% serious there. Even I can't come up with a joke that funny. This movie has a similar problem to Blue is the Warmest Color, in which it tries to replicate the slow day-to-day actions of character, but ends up with a lot of air and fluff with no real payoff. Which sucks, because again, the premise for this movie was amazing, but it's wasted on 80 minutes of nothingness. The setup for the undercover FBI agent is so weak that it couldn't even hold up a cooked noodle. The agent literally just runs up to Naza Malik and says, "Hey, do you want to buy a gun?" before Malik asks some questions about how much the gun costs, and then turns around and says, "Haha, jinx." The logic in the scene makes zero sense. In what backwards world is a black Muslim teenager going to even think about buying a gun from a sketchy white guy on the street? A 10-year-old could see this scene and tell you that the guy was probably working for the feds. The other FBI agent is almost hilariously incompetent. She follows around the boys in a very obvious Crown Vic for the entire movie and doesn't really do anything aside from sneer and look suspicious. She's just there for what writer-director Jay Dockendorf thought was a plot device, but she comes off as a literal device because she doesn't do anything. She just questions the boys once, and after learning that they're dodging back and forth across town to avoid family members because they're gay and not because they're terrorists, she gives them a slap on the wrist before telling them to stay out of trouble and leaves and goes about the rest of her day. It was a very cheap attempt to shed light on the profiling that black people and Muslim people face from the government. The original setup of the gun and the FBI agents lead to nothing, with a nothing payoff and no consequences. And it's just stuff that happens because the movie's gotta keep being a movie. And yes, I did take that from my review of Blue is the Warmest Color last week, but it's the exact same thing that happens in this movie as it did in that one. Each setup and plot point in this movie just rolls off as if it was something that was never brought up in the first place. Watching this movie felt like listening to a kid recap their day at school. It just bounces from one event to the next with no explanation or relevance. Naza Malik gets stopped by an undercover federal agent. Next, they get into an argument about their relationship. Next, Naz meets a closeted gay art seller. Next, they get questioned by the feds for real this time. Next, it's all beats with no rhythm or good lyrics. And speaking of lyrics, good lord is this movie's script terrible. Everyone talks like a robotic third grader reciting lines off a poster board for a school project. None of the lines have any thought it put into them, and it comes off as if Dockendorf didn't trust himself or his audience enough to be able to comprehend anything written above the complexity of a Dr. Seuss book. But even in some movies, a bad script can at least be made palatable with decent performances, but it shouldn't be surprising that this movie doesn't have that either. None of the performances have any real heart put into them. Everyone's robotic, saying their lines with a little bit of emphasis or none at all. There's a scene where someone literally fumbles over their lines and just keeps talking as if it didn't happen. Naza Malik deliver their lines and argue like school children in a play and not 18-year-olds having in-depth conversations about their relationship. It's so hard to believe that anyone took this movie seriously enough to call it good representation, let alone a movie. It tries so hard to pass off its poor writing and acting as something profound just because it's an indie movie with a controversial subject matter. It treats its characters like brownie points in hopes that that's enough to give this movie a pass on being good, instead of actually putting in the work to make sure that the end result is something worth watching. It really is an embarrassment for every identity that they try to cover. And for a movie that tries to bring light onto gay Muslims, its representation of Islam as a religion is very weak. All the movie does is throw around buzzwords like haram and halal. There's one scene where Naza Malik go to a mosque to pray and there's some Arabic spoken, but there's no actual look into Islam outside of a very basic and poor perspective that's very clearly written by someone who didn't do any type of research into the religion aside from whatever they see on Tumblr or Twitter. It's that liberal type of representation where the writers think that just because they bring up a marginalized identity that translates to it being good representation in writing, when that's just not the case. There's really nothing good that I have to say about this movie other than the fact that it started off with good intentions. It had the potential to be great, and I wanted it to be great because it's so rare that we see good representations of gay black people, especially black gay Muslims. Writer and director Jay Dockendorf clearly wanted to bring that to the screen, and I do applaud him for trying, but when the result is just this bad and so full of nothingness, it would have been better to wait until he had a proper and exceptional script and actors. I really don't like ragging on movies that try to be ambitious or just bad movies in general, because I've learned in the last couple of months that it's more work than it's worth. But Naza Malik makes it far too easy for this to be a laughingstock for people who don't think that LGBT representation is needed, especially for people outside of whiteness and Christianity. Just honestly, go watch Moonlight again because it's not worth wasting your hope or time on this movie.